I'd like to thank Tam for the invitation to speak this afternoon. I always welcome the opportunity to think more deeply about the artist and the art that I'm most interested in, so this was a great opportunity to do that. And I'm really very thankful for the opportunity to talk about outsider art, particularly in the context of early Texas art. Following Sarah's presentation and the others today, and talking with people connected with CASETA, one of the things that strikes me so deeply is how much there is to know about the artists, their histories, who learned from who studied, who traveled to be in someone else's company, to learn how artists were connected with movements, bringing movements back to communities. I found that all fascinating to learn more about, and enjoy the opportunity to talk with you all about artists for whom that is absent in their lives and their art. I'm looking forward to sharing with you this idea of the outsider artist as artists who live and create with little awareness, if not no awareness, of art history, the canon or academy of art, or their place in it. They have limited perception of themselves as artists, creating work for an audience, much less seeking one. I'll talk with you a bit about some of the terms outsider art and some of its antecedents in art brut. What we may think about is the idea that Jean Dubuffet, who was a French sculptor and painter in the 1940s, developed this idea of art brut. In addition to being a sculptor and a painter, Dubuffet was also a philosopher and a provocateur. He railed against the established conventional art world of his time. He thought that it was disingenuine. Artists were creating work for profit. They were influenced by things that took away from the purity of their art. And Dubuffet sought out, both in his own art and sought in the art of others, a more genuine, pure form of expression. He came upon this term, art brut, or raw art, to illustrate and get at some of those qualities that he was seeking. He developed this idea that at its best, these works were going to be developed by artists and by people who were isolated from the conventional art world, knowledge of art history, isolated and secluded from their participation in it. And as a result, they would be producing this more pure form of art. Dubuffet found those artists in mental asylums throughout Europe. He felt that these artists, who were both isolated psychiatrically, psychically, psychologically, but also isolated physically in that they were institutionalized, had access to more pure expression artistically. He focused a lot of his attention on a particular artist, Adolf Woofley, who lived most of his adult life in an asylum in Bern, Switzerland. And throughout his life in the asylum, Woofley created a body of work that reflected an entire inner reality that he had developed. His typical works were replete with characters, cryptic text, a lot of which has subsequently been studied by scholars and pieced together. His works also included musical connotation of his own design and creation. And so you get the sense that Adolf Woofley and these artists who Dubuffet was studying were creating work within their own mental realm, outside of the influences of society, outside of the conventions of society, and outside of any of that knowledge of the art world, which is what he was seeking. Interestingly enough, too, Dubuffet was interested in the art of children, which again provides some perspective on what he was after. His idea was that children, because they had not come under the direct influence yet of culture and society and education, that the art that they produced sprung from a purer and less spoiled place. And so while he focused most of his attention and in his creation of the Museum of Art Brut in Lausanne, Switzerland, Dubuffet also had this interest in the art of children. And in looking at the art of children, one of the things that often comes up in conversations with people when they're visiting our collection of outsider art, a common reaction is, oh, that looks like something my kid could do, or that looks like something that's on my refrigerator. And I think there is this connection that Dubuffet was making with children's art and the art that springs from this place of solitude and isolation that the outsider artists have. Fast forward to the 1970s, and the art critic, British art critic Roger Cardinal, was writing about this phenomenon of art brut. And in development of his book with his editor, they decided that they needed a better term than art brut for an American-speaking audience, that they might not be as welcoming of French. So Roger Cardinal developed this idea of outsider art. He meant this to be synonymous with art brut, and to again capture that quality of isolation and solitude in which the work is created. As the term and as his book was brought to a Western audience, a number of the ideas about art brut began to be expanded to include others within the society who work and live their lives on the fringes, not just psychiatrically, but artists who may be on the fringes of the dominant society or marginalized by it, by factors such as race or ethnicity, culture, economics, or geography. So, for instance, an artist like Bill Traylor, who some of you may know, his work began to be folded into this idea of the outsider artist. Bill Traylor was an ex-slave who in his late years moved to Montgomery, Alabama, after having worked on the farm, the plantation on which he had been a slave. And on the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, he proceeded to draw scenes of the world around him and from his memory. 6 of Bill Traylor's drawings have recently been acquired by the Smithsonian. Bill Traylor's work was collected by an artist in the 30s and the 40s and presented during that time without much attention or acclaim. But in the 70s, after Roger Cardinal's book and a growing appreciation of artists who had worked, as Bill Traylor had, in isolation as a slave, in isolation economically and socially, his work was seen in a different context. And now his work is among the most acclaimed of the outsider art world, included in many major institutions and museums throughout the country and the world. What I'd like to do, though, is to shift a bit off of the use of the terms and not get too caught up in the terms who is an outsider and who's not an outsider, but really to focus on the key elements of what that term means. And for me, that really is those aspects of isolation that is in the artist's work. And as Dubuffet said, art's best moments are when it forgets what it is called. I'll talk about 3 Texas artists this afternoon whose lives all involve an extreme level of isolation in their lives and their work that springs from that. The first artist who I'll talk about is Charles Delchaux. Charles Delchaux was born in Prussia in 1830. He immigrated to Texas through the port of Galveston. He came here in 1850. He soon settled in Richmond, Texas, where he worked as a butcher. He married in 1861. He married a widow with a daughter. During those years, Charles Delchaux lived, a workaday life as a butcher. In 1877, though, was a significant and tragic year for Delchaux. Both his wife and his young son died of yellow fever. He subsequently remarried, and again, a second wife and a son died of yellow fever. So, Charles Delchaux, it's easy to see that his life becomes somewhat unmoored in a way. He's removed and isolated from his culture of origin. He has lost significant family members, and he moves to Houston, Texas, where his eldest daughter has married into the Stelzig family. Charles goes to work for the family's saddlery and leather goods company. Some of you from Houston may know the Stelzig name. And the history is that Mr. Delchaux was a taciturn, cranky old man. Given his losses, he may have had some good reason to be, but also his German nature was that as well. And he, around the time of 1900, Charles recluses himself to the family attic at about the age of 70, 72. His family apparently didn't miss him a great deal. He participated in the family life, but no one questioned what Charles was doing in the attic, and he spent most of his time there. This time, though, that he did this was also a time of great technological change in the world. There was great inventiveness, and great inventions were on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. The Wright brothers were studying flight as well as many others, electrification, all manner of things were happening. And this is the part of the context and the mix of what was happening during Mr. Delshow's life as he reclused himself to the family attic. In 1923, Charles Delshow died. The contents of whatever was going on in his attic were untouched and undisturbed until 1967, when there was a fire at the family home and the contents of Charles Delshow's attic were tossed out onto the sidewalk. There, Fred Washington, a local junk and antiques dealer in Houston, picked them up and took them to his shop, where they remained where the contents remained under a tarp. What Fred Washington took to his shop were 14 to 16 hand-bound volumes of books that chronicled Charles Delshow's participation in a secret society of men called the Sonora Flight Club. This society of men were involved in the design and manufacture and flight of lighter-than-air flying machines. The books were rendered in great detail with great representation of the flying machines that this group of men were involved in creating. Many of the early drawings of Delshow resemble very elaborate mechanical drawings with very beautiful European text. Charles Delshow, in his books, represents himself as the draftsman of the group. And again, they're very mechanical in nature. But as you go forward in the books and Delshow's production of them, the drawings become increasingly elaborate. The drawings become much more decorative, colorful, and fantastical in their way. He includes, he starts many of his drawings, as you can see, with a grid, which is kind of a mechanical artist's way of approaching a drawing. And then he proceeds to represent the drawing in vivid detail. As his drawings proceed, more color, more design, other elements begin to be added to them. The drawings are full of secret code and cryptic messages that allude to what the drawings are about. And again, I want to emphasize this idea of isolation in Delshow's life. He is producing these works over the last 20 years of his life, alone in his attic, never talking to anyone about them, never having expressed to anyone any interest in science or technology or inventions or news of the day. This was all done in complete private and solitude. His drawings are fascinating in a number of ways to people who study them. Some of the mechanics that are included in Delshow's drawings seem to predate things that had been actually invented at the time, such as the wheel landing mechanism. So in some way, so again, this level of thought and sophistication in what Mr. Delsho knew and understood was not known and understood to anyone who knew him, which is a fascinating thing to think about, and which I often try to imagine in his life and in the other artists who we'll talk about this afternoon, what that must have been like for them as a real person to be producing these works of art in the way that they did. The drawings also included details of the daily lives of the men with whom he worked. The books also include great detail about their meetings. There are minutes of their planning meetings, details of their trips that they took in their flying machines, a complete detailed fantasy world. As Charles Delsho's books and work proceeded over these 2 decades, as you can see, the drawings become looser, they become more decorative. It's as if Charles Delsho becomes more immersed in his own world, where his initial drawings were more concrete representations of the things that he was making or that he had imagined making. He becomes more immersed in it, and the drawings and renderings of what he called arrows become more like art. He begins to include aspects of collage in his work, referencing news reports of flight and other technological innovations of the day. And it becomes quite innovative and creative in his own manufacture of these images. They become more elaborate, almost like spaceships in their way, crafts from another world, which they well might have been, until the very latter drawings take on, again, more watercolor painting, more elaboration, a very much looseness of their structure. Delsho's works have a lot of appeal for ufologists. It turns out that there are newspaper clippings and reports throughout Oklahoma and Texas of farmers who were visited by men in strange flying machines, had conversations with them in their fields, and then the men got back into their flying machines and flew away. There are actual newspaper clippings about these things. And Delsho at times seems to also have a sense of humor and a sly wink and a nod, teasing you that these things are real, maybe. Somewhere in his drawings there may be a maybe not. But again, fascinating to think about a Prussian immigrant coming to the United States, spending the last years of his life creating these works in such deep isolation, and that no one knew about them until they were pitched out onto the sidewalk. The last part of that story is that they were found by a student at St. Thomas University and then presented to Dominique de Menil, who bought 2 of the books, which are now in the Menil collection. Many of the other books, they think there were a total of 16, were dispersed to various museums. The Whitty Museum, I think, has 3, and other museums around the world have the rest. And 2 or 3 of the books were disassembled by people who bought them, and occasionally Charles Delsho drawings show up in the art market and the art world, where they're coveted by outsider art collectors. The second artist who I'll talk with you this afternoon about is Frank Jones. Frank Jones, too, lived a life of isolation that took on a very powerful form later in his life. Frank Jones was born in Clarksville, Texas in 1900, just 35 years after the Civil War. Frank Jones his story of isolation really begins at his birth. The story is that Frank Jones was born with a caul over his left eye at his birth, a caul being the popular term of the day for a part of the placental membrane that can cover a newborn's head at birth. In African American tradition, someone born with a caul over their eye is thought to be given second sight, which allows the child to potentially see into the spirit world. So Frank Jones grew up with both the expectation that he would be able to see into the spirit world, and that for him, that experience became real. Frank Jones grew up seeing evil spirits in those around him and even in animals. This experience led him to lead and have a very troubled life. He became very directionless, heavy drinking, at odds with his neighbors and family, and eventually had a very violent life. His life resulted in a series of convictions for violent crimes and ultimately resulted in a life imprisonment sentence at Huntsville, Texas in 1960. There, Frank Jones began to draw. His initial drawings were simple structures that he called devil houses. They were made up of compartments. This one has 6, with spikes that he said alluded to fire and smoke. And at the periphery of these devil houses were representations of the evil spirits that had followed him throughout his life. Many of the spirits, and we'll see them in other drawings, seem to be smiling. And there's sometimes a misinterpretation when someone sees a Frank Jones drawing that the devils seem happy or the creatures seem happy. Frank Jones said that the devils were smiling as a way of drawing you into their clutches, and once they had you, then you were under their power, and their smiles were beguiling and meant to capture you. Frank Jones's drawings began to become more elaborate, and the devils became more elaborate as well, and came to be housed within the devil houses. With this one as well, his drawings began to replicate in a both concrete and abstract way his life experience. So on the upper right-hand corner, you see what appears to be a clock in a clock tower. You can see how this drawing begins to appear to look like Huntsville State Prison. Frank Jones's drawings again became more and more elaborate. And in 1964, Huntsville held its first annual prison arts show and competition. The story is that Frank Jones, who once he came to Huntsville, became a very quiet and docile man. He became consumed by his drawing and spent most of his time doing that. He was thought of by the other prisoners as being kind of slow and, as another wrote about him, dim-witted. And people did not pay much attention to Frank Jones and what he was doing. The Prison Art Show in 1964 occurred, and the guards, as a joke, entered Frank Jones's drawings into the art show. The art show was judged by museum and gallery people from Huntsville and Houston, and Frank Jones's drawings were awarded first prize. They saw in his work the work of a sophisticated artist representing an inner world and an inner reality with his own vocabulary of images and a unique way of representing and rendering them. Frank Jones's drawings continued to develop and expand over his about 7-year period of drawing. He began to develop an entire vocabulary of devil images. There were gambling devils, cheating devils. These drawings get to be about 2.5 by 2 feet, so they become large as well. The initial drawings were on small found paper. His blue and white pencils were salvaged from the prison accounting department, so he worked with stubs of blue and red pencils. After his discovery at the Prison Art Show, which was also attended by Dallas art dealer Chapman Kelly and his assistant Murray Smither, they began taking Frank Jones more proper drawing materials. At least they thought they were more proper. So his drawings got bigger, but Frank Jones always relied on his small red and blue pencils for his drawings. Frank learned how to write his name and prison number on the bottom of his drawings, but was illiterate. And so again, this was his way of representing and both living with and controlling these demons who had lived with him and affected his life so deeply. One can conjecture that Frank Jones led a more docile and peaceful life while he was in prison because he had found a way to control the demons that had followed him throughout his life and that had resulted in his incarceration. He had found a very sophisticated way, I think, to both have a concrete representation of his corporal experience of living in prison, but also at the same time abstracting his deep psychological experience of living with the demons and devils that he lived with throughout his life. They represent, his drawings, again, this deep level of isolation that he began experiencing as a child, and that ultimately resulted in his physical isolation, his incarceration, and then his immersion into this world of drawing and representing his life. The last artist that I'll talk with you about this afternoon is Forrest Bess, who may be familiar to some of you. Though Forrest Bess is not considered an outsider artist, his life and art contained, again, this high degree of isolation. It connects his work with the meanings of the term outsider art, though his art is not included under that umbrella, but with its traditions. I think he serves as an interesting contrast and complement to the ideas about outsider art and art brut, focusing on that central core of isolation. Forrest Bess was born in 1911 in Bay City, Texas. Throughout his childhood, he traveled with his father and family throughout the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma. His father was an oil field roughneck. He attended Texas A&M and the University of Texas at the encouragement of his family to study architecture, but Forrest found himself more interested in philosophy and religion and mythology, and also in painting. As a young man, he traveled through Mexico, and returning back to Bay City in the 30s, his paintings were of a more impressionistic style. There's a very nice Forrest Bess painting in Rayoni Gallery in the art show next door, a very nice painting of two boys at a beach scene that again is of a very impressionistic style. But at this time too, Forrest began to paint renderings of images that would come to him, as he wrote about, in a semi-dream state between being awake and falling asleep. He would write and talk about images that he would see at this time, which would later become the paintings that would dominate most of his production. In the 1940s, he served in the military with the Army Corps of Engineers, designing camouflage. He suffered a mental breakdown towards the end of his service and was discharged and returned to Bay City and set up a bait and fish camp at Chiquapin Bay. As you can see, a somewhat isolated environment, accessible only by water. And there he set up, again, a bait and fish camp. Forrest Bess continued to make most of his subsistence living from bait and fishing. One can begin to see some of the parallels with the outsider artists in terms of psychiatric isolation resulting in or happening concurrently to physical isolation, living out in this remote camp. And Forrest Bess appeared familiar with this idea, talking about his best functioning being able to occur when he's completely removed from society. For Forrest Bess, he began to focus more on, again, these, what he used the term visionary as a way of defining himself as an artist. He saw and thought of what he experienced during this twilight time between wakefulness and sleeping as being a visionary experience, and that these symbols that he saw became part of a broader belief system that they helped inform. And this belief system that he developed would be the system and the means and the source of really his own personal and artistic isolation. Forrest Bess's paintings during this part of his career and the period for which he's best known for really seems to have a lot to do with his desire to understand and reconcile dualities, both dualities in life and in nature. From a personal standpoint, Forrest Bess was a gay man. He wrote about his conflicts of being homosexual. He found the dualities in his own life of being, as he called himself, a bold outdoorsman, and on the other hand, a sensitive artist, and looked towards his painting as a way of reconciling that duality. He was interested in the dualities of man, good and evil, and distinctions of gender. He was also very interested in the dualities of nature, creation, destruction, light and dark, life and death. Forrest Bess read deeply and sought information from all subjects to help for him to both understand and develop his own thinking, much of which would be, again, what would ultimately be those isolating factors in his life and art. His reading and understanding seemed to come from three main sources for him. One was alchemy, the pre-scientific practice of transforming base materials into precious or idealized one. The practice of alchemy and the description of it had both spiritual and physical components. Bess was also very interested in Jungian psychology and had carried on a long correspondence with Carl Jung. Bess, through Jungian psychology, came to think that the symbols that he was seeing and painting were the means of reconciling and bringing together in an idealized way the subconscious and the conscious into an ideal state of being. And lastly, for Forrest Bess, and most explicitly, the third area that informed his thinking were ancient Aboriginal practices of ritual genital surgery in the service of creating what was called a pseudo-hermaphrodite, which in Aboriginal practice and ultimately in Forrest Bess's own practice was at the service of creating an idealized human, again, reconciling the disparity of genders, which ultimately for Forrest Bess was thought to hold the key to immortality. These, again, are the ideas that would both fuel his artistic practice and his artistic production, but would serve to be that which isolated him. I talked a bit about the amount of correspondence that Forrest Bess conducted throughout his life. And this is one of the ways in which Forrest Bess was different from the outsider artist. Forrest was very interested in engaging others, like Carl Jung, in his ideas, seeking both affirmation of them and information that would add to them. He always found this a difficult and to put it mildly, oft-putting experience. His longtime New York dealer, Betty Parsons, was always reluctant to include any of the explanatory material that Forrest Bess encouraged her to include in his exhibitions. She had a sense that this would not add to his sales. But Forrest Bess, in his own, again, to try to imagine being Forrest Bess, in his own way, he thought that these things were essential. The paintings for him were a tool, a means to an end of understanding himself and his experience, and must have thought that his ideas and the expression of those ideas was just as important. And to have the experience of others not cooperating in that seems, must have been experienced as a very isolating type of experience. Also, he carried on a long correspondence with art historian Meyer Shapiro, who always cautioned him not to talk or present these ideas or his experiences to the world. Carl Jung was dismissive of his ideas, saying that they were unoriginal and ideas that people rediscovered every 25 to 50 years. It turned out that only John Money of the Gender Reassignment Clinic at Johns Hopkins University was genuinely interested in Forrest Bess's practices, but not from an art standpoint. He saw Forrest Bess as a case study and included him in several journals of gender study and gender reassignment. But Forrest Bess's paintings are what he left and what are so engaging to a modern audience. Many of his symbolic paintings read very easily as landscapes. Water and sky, land and sea, moon, celestial and earth, moon and sun. Ground and air. In others, Bess's vocabulary of symbols are central. He wrote of seeking the meaning of the symbols that he would, again, these are the symbols that he would see in this gray area between wakefulness and sleep. And by painting them, he was seeking their meaning. the act of painting them, he thought was making them lucid to himself. This is Forrest Bess's painting titled Hermaphrodite. But ultimately, his art was a solitary expression of intensely held beliefs that few, if any, held. And again, I try to understand what that must have been like for artists like Forrest Bess and like Delsho and Frank Jones. Held ideas and beliefs, had experiences that no one else had. That this isolation, which was central to Bess's art and central to Jones's and Delsho's, is really at the essence of what I think of as the outsider artist. I've enjoyed the chance to talk with you this afternoon. Thank you. Any questions or comments or ideas? Yes.
In 2012, Robert Gover took the writing that he could find of Forrest Bess and some of his work and exhibited it at the Whitney Biennial. And subsequent to that, the Menil Collection did an expanded version of that exhibition.
Yes.
So Forrest Bess' hope of combining his writings with his work was realized posthumously. Was that a success? Did you have a chance to see it at the Biennial or the Menil?
I did. I saw it at the Menil. And it was interesting to watch. Sarah was talking about the idea of the nude and always, taking the kids right to it. And I was at that exhibit several times. They had Forrest's materials in a case where you could see, and Forrest Bess photographed his self-surgery very explicitly. And I spent time watching people encounter that material. And there was almost an exclusive recoiling from it. I can imagine people who knew his story could be drawn into it by way of seeing what they had always heard about, read about, but I could sense the barrier that Betty Parsons, his dealer, and others might have anticipated had he done that at his exhibitions. But I thought it was brave of them to do, of course, and to have his full story realized. Yeah. Yes.
Are the letters published?
They are. There are sources for them. Not a complete collection of them, but examples are out there, and they're on the internet. There are a couple of good Forrest Bess sites.
Where are the letters physically?
Now that's a good question. I'm not a Forrest Bess scholar, so I'm not certain where they all are.
They're in the archives. Randy's done a lot of work on this. Archives of American Art.
Okay. Good.
We didn't hear that.
Archives of American Art on microfilm, and Randy Tibbetts has collected all of them, I think, which is where I borrowed them, but that's where they're from. And the Carter has a copy of the archives, as does the Museum of Fine Arts Houston has a copy of the archives.
Any others? Sarah?
But going back to Frank Jones,
Yeah.
I was curious about that Huntsville art exhibition at the prison. Was that something they had made a tradition of doing? I've heard that in Louisiana.
It's something that became a tradition, but the 64 show was the first show that Frank Jones, and
What spurred that? Like, was it the prisoners wanting to do it, or was it someone else that had seen the works?
I don't know that history well either. Who were the forces behind making that happen?
Very cool. And it's still going on, or?
Yes.
Thank
Good.
you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks.